Okay. Welcome everybody, also today, to a new seminar organized by Abstraction. And today we have the honor to host here Hamad Al-Azary, who is a researcher at the University of Lawrence Technological University, which, my bad, I thought it was in Canada, but it is in the USA. It's near Detroit, so it's almost on the border with Canada. Yeah. Let me see. No, yeah, it's fine. There is a pop-up here. This is, I will briefly say a couple of words as usual on these seminars. These seminars are organized by Abstraction and in particular by our group, the Abstraction group, which is an ERC project funded by the European Union, Abstraction Unlocking Meaning from Experience Through Language. And within our project, we work on how abstraction mechanisms are enabled, are supported by words, by language. And our focuses are on the cognitive side, let's say, and so how abstraction works in thought somehow, and then how abstraction processes can be modeled in language, and how language works and helps us to abstract. So today's speaker is Hamad Al-Azary. As I said, he is assistant professor in psychology at Lawrence Technological University, and he works on semantic processing, metaphor, and concepts. We met, I think, in Amsterdam.
Yes.
Was it? Yes. At previous conferences on metaphor, and then we met again in Oxford, one of the conferences that are organized in Oxford, the creative power of metaphor. And I mean, Hamad worked with the guru of metaphor processing, one of the gurus of metaphor processing, Albert Katz. Where was that? Still in Canada.
Yeah, University of Western Ontario.
Exactly. That was where you had your PhD done. Exactly. And recently, Hamad has published extensively on metaphor processing, but not only metaphor processing, also semantic categorization and semantic memory and so forth. So we are very glad to have the opportunity to host a seminar by Hamad here today. And with no further delay, I will let the floor to him to talk to us about the semantics of abstraction, linguistic, and embodied factors. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mariana, for inviting me and for that kind introduction. So it's true, I am at Lawrence Technological University, and the flyer had Canada on there. So as Mariana pointed out, it's not in Canada. I am Canadian, so it's a very easy to understand error. And she's exactly right. Lawrence Tech is only 23 minutes away from Canada, so it's practically Canada. So for today's talk, I would like to cover various topics. I want to describe my approach to concepts by emphasizing them as semantic representations. And as semantic representations, concepts differ, they vary on a number of dimensions, and we'll be talking about some of those dimensions. These dimensions come from linguistic experience in addition to sensory motor experience. And then I'll talk about concepts when they're used in metaphor, particularly because to understand a metaphor, one must compute an abstraction. So metaphors are these tools that automatically compute abstractions, so I'll be talking about that. And then I'll focus on metaphor, on how semantic representations interact in this metaphorical abstraction. So the relationship between concepts and their abstraction. So concepts are, of course, mental representations. We access them and we manipulate them for a variety of cognitive operations, including language. Some concepts can be represented by words. Many can be represented by words. And the semantic representations that these words evoke are stored in long-term memory. So the word bridge here will evoke a particular semantic representation. So by their nature, concepts are semantic representations, and there is a relationship between the linguistic system, the lexicon, and the conceptual system. So words evoke concepts. And metaphor creates abstractions from concrete semantic representations. I just realized that, is this bothering you, this little window here? Could I move this maybe? Or minimize it? Is that better for you? Now you can see the screen better, yeah. So metaphor creates abstraction from concrete semantic representations. So if we take bridge here, we can put it in a metaphor and juxtapose it with language, and now suddenly bridge is processed as an abstraction, no longer as a primarily concrete concept. So as semantic representations, concepts have two distinct sources of semantics. These sources are first, not first in terms of order, but one of them is sensory motor experience. So from being in the world and having a body and having a sensory motor system, you accumulate a lot of information about concepts. So if you take a bird, for example, from viewing birds, your visual experience of birds, you see that birds have feathers, they fly, they have a beak, they have wings. This experience, visual experience, feeds into your conceptual representation of bird. In addition, sensory motor experience is multimodal, so the auditory properties of birds are also evoked when one encounters the word bird, and these auditory properties make up the concept as well. And finally, tactile and motoric interactions as well. So this is a multimodal kind of system. Another source of semantics is linguistic experience. So the way that the word bird is used in language results in this kind of network of associations, and these networks of associations can be based on the co-occurrence of words. So bird co-occurs with other words, and this can be studied and modeled with distributed semantic models. So taken together, there are two distinct sources of semantics, and they both contribute to conceptual representation. And I'll be talking about how these sources contribute to abstraction. So here, this network of associations is what's known as a semantic neighborhood. So a semantic neighborhood is a cluster of associations of words that share meaning. So this here is a semantic neighborhood of the word psychology, and here you can see, maybe you can't see them very well, but you see some of these words like neural, psycholinguistics is here, and so on and so forth. So semantic neighborhoods vary in an important variable called semantic neighborhood density. And in these models, these distributed semantic models, words are represented as vectors in a high-dimensional space. And as vectors, one can determine the semantic distance of words operationalized as cosine similarity. So cosine is the angle between vectors, and then cosines closer to 0 mean no semantic resemblance, no semantic relationship, whereas cosines closer to 1 mean greater semantic relationship, and 1 would be identical semantic relationship. So from this measure of semantic distance, one can look at the semantic distance of a word and its semantic neighbors around it. And here we have the word book. And then this is an example of a dense semantic neighborhood because most of these neighbors, as you can see, they're in this range here. So they're related to the word book. You can see some of them like wrote, author, published. These are all pretty highly related to the word book. On the other hand, we can look at the word boomerang. And boomerang would be an example of a word in a sparse semantic neighborhood. Its neighbors are less related to it compared to the neighbors of book, and it's their relationship to book. So semantic neighborhood density is a continuous variable. Here I'm dichotomizing it, and we have, again, a dense semantic neighborhood and a sparse semantic neighborhood. Another important variable in semantic representations is concreteness, abstractness. Words like book refer to things that exist in the physical world, things that are spatially delineated, things that can be experienced, again, with the sensory motor system. A word like idea does not refer to an object in the same way that book does. So an idea is an abstract word. Concrete words like book are represented by both sensory motor and linguistic properties, whereas abstract words like idea are represented more so by linguistic properties, again, because they don't have direct sensory motor reference. Another important distinction among concepts has to do with how one can motorically interact with a concept. So for example, if I show you here a balloon and a rainbow, or a cat and a butterfly, or a bicycle and an anchor, you'll notice that all of these concepts are concrete, okay? But the concepts on the left are somewhat difficult to physically interact with relative to the concepts on the right. And this is captured by a variable known as body-object interaction. So we have words that are lower on body-object interaction and words that are higher. So taken together, we see that there are multiple variations in semantic representations. There are more than these, but these are what I'm going to focus on in today's seminar. And again, these are semantic neighborhood density, which has to do with how close a word's semantic neighbors are to it in semantic space, with words being from dense neighborhoods like book or sparse neighborhoods like boomerang. Concreteness, abstractness. So words like book are concrete, whereas words like idea are abstract. And finally, body-object interaction, with words like book being high in body-object interaction and words like rainbow being low body-object interaction. So I'm going to describe how these variables, these are distinct variables, and they have the potential to interact, and importantly, they have the potential to influence abstraction, which I'll be talking about. So one more thing I'll say is that the words on the left here are considered more semantically rich than the words on the right, which would be less semantically rich. So some of the research questions I have that I'm going to address are, how are these properties, okay, of semantic representations, how are they accessed, how early are they accessed, and what affects their accessibility? Additionally, I'll look at how these semantic representations interact to form and compute these metaphorical abstractions. And then I'll also look at what properties of semantic representations are accessed during metaphorical abstraction. So what's really going on when we're forming an abstraction through metaphor? So for this first question, how are properties of semantic representations accessed online? I have this EEG study that looked at abstract and concrete words. So here's some example of the stimuli. We have abstract words like euphoria, and then we have concrete words that differ on BOI, body-object interaction. So remember, these words are concrete, but they differ on the ease with which you can motorically interact with them. And what this experiment involved first was this semantic categorization task. Okay? So what the participants were asked to do was for each word presented one at a time, just simply push one button if it refers to something you can touch, or another button if it's something you can't touch. And both BOI conditions are touchable. Even though one is more difficult to touch than the other, they're still touchable. So what we see here is, this is the N400 response. The N400 is a event-related potential that's associated with semantic processing and semantic access. So what we see here is that the red line is the high BOI, the blue line is low BOI, and the dashed line is abstract. And what we can initially tell from here is that these semantic representations based on sensory motor and linguistic experience are accessed very early, okay, as early as we can tell with the N400. So again, the abstract words are more represented by linguistic experience, whereas the concrete words are represented by both sensory motor and linguistic experience. So this kind of distinction can be kind of viewed in this N400 response. Now, what we also see is that this kind of aspect of concreteness as a multimodal kind of variable, you can tease it apart with tasks, okay? So the notoric difference between these words can be teased apart with a task like, can you touch the concept or not? So by drawing attention to body-object interaction, we can see a distinction between high and low BOI words. Now, what happens if we repeat this task? You have a question? Yes, yeah.
How is the body-object interaction?
Yeah. So it's a normed variable. It's a participant normed variable, and it's supported by a wide range of studies that show high BOI words are read faster usually than low BOI words. High BOI words activate more kinesthetic regions of the brain, and so on and so forth. So it's a normed variable, and it's been studied well enough that we can see pretty consistent differences in the processing of these words.
And you can distinguish between high body words and low words. Thanks to, I don't know, sometimes ranges.
Yeah. So people are basically given, and it's a good question. People are given like rate the ease with which somebody can interact with it. So it's not necessarily how much you have, but how possible is it? And then it's rated on like on a 7-point likelihood scale. The explicit ratings, yeah. And there's some debate about what's the best way to kind of conceptualize it, because the definition that's commonly used is the ease with which somebody can do that, but not everybody will necessarily interact with certain concepts. So like a word like brick gets a high BOI rating, but most people haven't interacted with a brick. So there is some kind of debate on the best way to conceptualize it. Yeah, thank you for the question. So we do see this early distinction among these semantic representations. Okay? So people are processing abstract meaning and embodied meaning really early, and this task seems to tap into body-object interaction. Now, what happens if we repeat this task, and instead of asking people to categorize the concepts as touchable or untouchable, what if we ask them to categorize them as concrete or abstract? Okay? So same stimuli, but different task. We see that we lose the BOI effect. Okay? So in this task, by drawing attention only to concreteness, the motoric aspect of these concepts is no longer accessed online, at least measured by the N400. So we see virtually no difference between high and low BOI words here. So the point here is two things. One, that sensory motor and linguistic representations are accessed early and they're accessed online. Again, the abstract words being represented by linguistic system and the concrete words being represented by sensory motor and linguistic systems. And that another important point is that this conceptual processing, okay, results from the actual stimuli and the contextual constraints. They interact and then they constrain what aspects of meaning are processed. Important for metaphor because metaphor is a context for concepts. Okay, and metaphor, simply put, is a semantic juxtaposition. So we're taking concepts and we're putting them side by side. And by doing so, to process the metaphorical meaning, there must be some kind of abstraction to occur. Because if you don't have abstraction, then you're only going to be processing concrete literal meaning primarily, and then you're going to lose the actual conveyed metaphorical meaning. So I have examples here of different kinds of metaphors across different syntactical variations and parts of speech. And you see that the words in italics are all metaphorical in that context. Metaphors are important to study, not only to understand abstraction processes, but just by the fact that people produce millions of metaphors over their lives. They occur, that their production occurs around age 3. There could be some delayed onset. There could be metaphor impairments, but metaphor is simply just a big part of life and human experience. Metaphor aids cognition in both and social interaction, both cognition and social interaction. It's effective for describing emotions and abstract concepts and experiences, communicating science, and especially new discoveries. When new things are invented, people often use metaphor to name them. So like the internet being described as a web, for example. In teaching, metaphor is used. There's many examples of metaphor affecting persuasion and reasoning. So if we describe a pandemic as a war versus a storm, war will evoke more anxiety and maybe even action that people have to take, whereas storm evokes more kind of waiting it out. And metaphor also enhances social bonds and empathy. So if I tell you psychology is the chameleon of sciences, or maybe linguistics is the chameleon of sciences, I'm inviting you to take my own perspective using a metaphor that may be difficult to carry out with literal language. So they're literally untrue, but very powerful conceptual and linguistic tools. They're a puzzle for semantic processing, but they involve abstraction. How they involve abstraction? Well, metaphors, their processing invites abstraction. We have here languages of bridge. These psychological processing mechanisms from cognitive psychology, there's two main ones. One of them is called structure mapping, which you may have come across. Structure mapping basically says that metaphors, like languages of bridge, are processed by analogy mechanisms. So to process languages of bridge, what you have to do is align language and bridge together and find some kind of commonality. And usually with metaphor and analogy, the commonality is something kind of abstract. So we can think about language may involve two people communicating, a bridge involves 2 points, and then from that you have this kind of connection, abstract meaning that comes out from aligning them. Roughly how it works in plain terms. Another mechanism is categorization. So here what's happening is the word bridge is thought to represent an abstract category of something that connects, and then we're simply categorizing language into that ad hoc category. Both of these models have received empirical support, and although they've been debated in the field, they're really not that different. They're both saying that abstraction is kind of this end result of metaphor. Whether you get there through analogy or categorization, they both agree the end result is abstraction. So abstraction in metaphor processing is not necessarily a controversial topic. It's widely accepted and supported with psycholinguistic experiments that I can tell you about if you're interested, but that indicate some kind of abstraction. Now, I'll be focusing on these nominal metaphors initially. Nominal metaphors you've already come across, like language is a bridge, and they involve two nouns. That's what makes them nominal. And the first concept, or the concept that the metaphor is about, is the topic, whereas the word that we're using metaphorically, the word that the abstraction is computed from, is the vehicle. And a broad research question I have is, which types of semantic representations of the vehicle are most suitable or amenable for metaphoric abstraction? In addition, I look at how do the topic and vehicle semantic representations interact to produce this kind of metaphorical abstraction. So to tackle this question, I have a number of experiments, and I'll talk to you about some that involved the stimulus set that I constructed of nominal metaphors. So here I have a pen as a sword, and I wanted to make metaphors that varied on these semantic representations I talked to you about. So notice that with nominal metaphors, what usually happens is that the vehicle words almost always tend to be more concrete than the topic words. The topic words can usually be abstract or concrete, whereas the vehicle words tend to be concrete. So I wanted to manipulate this aspect of concreteness. So here's an example of what I call a concrete metaphor, because the topic word is concrete. And it just so happens that both pen and sword come from these high semantic density spaces. So both pen and sword are imageable, they're concrete, and they have many near neighbors in semantic space. Yes?
Sorry.
No?
In this kind of metaphor, for example, that you say that the vehicle tends to be more concrete, but in this case, the vehicle has probably less body object interaction.
Yeah, correct.
Does it influence the construction of metaphor?
Absolutely, yeah. So in these studies, I'm looking at concreteness and semantic density only, and I'm going to visit body-object interaction again. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. Pen probably has higher body-object interaction than sword, at least for most people living today. But we will visit BOI near the end. So another way to vary metaphors is to look at abstract topics. So language as a bridge is an example of an abstract topic metaphor. And again, both language and bridge have many near neighbors, so they're considered high semantic density. Okay. Now, we can also look at metaphors that are low semantic neighborhood density. So a pond is a mirror is an example of a concrete metaphor that's low semantic neighborhood density. Again, concrete because both topic and vehicle are concrete. We can look at a metaphor that has an abstract topic and low semantic neighborhood density, which is abstract low semantic neighborhood density, like responsibility is a chain. So we have these variations, and we can think about how the metaphor as a whole differs in semantic richness. Okay? So if we look at a pen as a sword, Both words are highly semantically rich, both concrete, and they both have many near neighbors in semantic space. Now, we can decrease the semantic richness if we have an abstract topic. So language as a bridge is an example of an abstract high semantic density metaphor. So it's less semantically rich than a pen as a sword. Now the semantically sparsest metaphor would be something like responsibility as a chain, because again, the topic is abstract and both words have few near neighbors. And a pond as a mirror would be kind of this one step more rich. So this is like a rough way to rank semantic richness of metaphors by looking at topic concreteness and topic vehicle semantic density. And the question is, how are these metaphors kind of processed? Or are there even any processing differences between them? So I developed experimental sentences that fit these semantic richness conditions. So I developed metaphors, like I showed you earlier. I had 12 in each of these semantic conditions. I just have a couple examples here. But again, the concreteness of the topic was manipulated in addition to semantic density of the entire metaphor, of both topics and vehicles. I developed some anomalous sentences that really shouldn't make any sense. And these also differed on the topic concreteness and topic vehicle density. And I also had literal sentences that varied on density. These, I couldn't really make abstract literal sentences or make many of them. That's part of the reason why we have metaphors. So these were all concrete. I made the literal sentences to indicate some kind of like ceiling effect for comprehension, and then the anomalous sentence to indicate no real comprehension. And then metaphors were therefore interpreted relative to that ceiling and that floor. And the first thing I did with these sentences is I just asked participants to rate them on a scale of 1 to 6. How much sense do these sentences make to you? I didn't tell them necessarily some will be metaphorical or some will be literal or anything like that. I just asked them, just give it a rating. You don't have to explain the metaphor, just kind of go with your hunch, your gut feeling. Well, first of all, the literal sentences were all rated at ceiling, which is good. Everybody understood the literal meaning. And the nonsense sentences were pretty much at floor. The metaphors were in the middle. So this is telling us that there is some kind of meaningful processing going on with these metaphors because they were novel, right? So people were able to get some meaning from there. So this is a good kind of check. But looking at the metaphors more closely, and I should mention the y-axis is how much sense it makes. Now, for the metaphors, we see this interaction. And as I mentioned to you earlier, the comprehensibility of a metaphor depends on that abstraction. So we can kind of think of this as which of the metaphors had this kind of abstraction kind of potential. Okay. Now notice that for low semantic neighborhood density metaphors, the topic's representation didn't matter in terms of concreteness. They were rated as equally comprehensible. For the high semantic neighborhood density metaphors, we see that topic concreteness plays a big role. And it plays a role such that the semantically richest condition, the concrete topic and high semantic density metaphors, they were rated the lowest in terms of comprehensibility. Okay, so we're seeing that this metaphor processing, metaphor abstraction is affected by the representation of both topic and vehicle. Okay? And it's affected in such a way that the semantically richest condition is the least comprehensible. So the kind of explanation there is that the richer the semantically richer the metaphor is, the more properties, whether they're linguistic properties from the semantic neighborhoods or concrete properties from concrete topics, they need to be inhibited okay, in order to compute that that metaphorical abstraction. That's the explanation I have here. Now, this is an example of an offline task. People are given as much time as they want to rate them, and it's hard to know when do these semantic variables actually kick in? When do they really play a role in the process? So I repeated this experiment, but I added a time pressure for the participants. Okay? I would show them the metaphor and leave it on the screen, or show them the sentence rather, and leave it on the screen for maybe 600 milliseconds, which isn't that long at all, or maybe 1600 milliseconds. And then I'd ask them to make a decision really quickly if it makes sense or if it doesn't make sense. And I only gave them 400 milliseconds to make that decision. So this is a very difficult task. You can imagine you barely have time to read it, and then you have to make a really quick decision if it makes sense or doesn't make sense. So this task involves a lot of practice, and sometimes the participants would tell me, they were guessing, or they don't even know what they read. They just kind of, did rapid response. But I can tell you that they weren't guessing, because the literal statements, so blue is this early deadline of 600 milliseconds, red is the later deadline at 1600 milliseconds. The literal statements made sense at both deadlines, okay, which is good. The metaphors made more sense than the nonsense sentences, even at both deadlines. So you're getting metaphor processing very, very early. But we haven't talked yet about the actual semantic variables. So what's really going on with the metaphors at this very rapid and then delayed presentation deadline? Well, we see that when the metaphors are shown only for 600 milliseconds, with 400 milliseconds to make a decision, there's already some distinction between the semantic richness variables, such that the semantically richest condition is the least comprehensible. Okay, so this is very, very early. Now, what happens when we leave a second of processing time? Well, everything goes up in comprehensibility except that semantically rich condition, that concrete high semantic density condition. So that one kind of stays low. And what this means is these semantic variables, these semantic richness variables, play an early effect, but doesn't necessarily play a delayed downstream effect. It plays a pretty early effect in computing a metaphorical abstraction. And the semantically richest condition kind of has a very reduced kind of ability for computing these metaphorical abstractions. When you add time, it doesn't really help in computing this semantic abstraction. So a good way to think about this distinction among these metaphors is that the greater the semantic richness, the greater the required inhibition is to compute that metaphorical abstraction. So to compute the abstraction of sword, okay, will require a lot of inhibition. Computing the abstraction of sword in a pen as a sword requires inhibiting some of the concrete features of pen that are irrelevant for the abstraction of sword. The fact that pens hold ink and they're for writing, that doesn't help compute the abstraction of sword, right? In addition, you have to inhibit some near neighbors of sword that may not necessarily help in that abstraction. So other associations related to sword will need to be inhibited. Now, when you get to something like responsibility as a chain, well, the abstraction of chain is going to be relatively easy to compute because responsibility doesn't have any concrete features that are going to inhibit this abstraction. And both concepts don't have a lot of near associations that kind of stop that abstraction from being computed. So these semantically less rich concepts are kind of more flexible for abstraction. They don't have as many properties that need to be inhibited as semantically rich concepts. So the greater semantic richness, the greater required inhibition. Okay, so if it has to do with inhibition, we can maybe explore that question by looking at a case of deep dyslexia. Now, deep dyslexia is a reading disorder that one may acquire as a result of left hemisphere brain damage. So people with deep dyslexia often have aphasia, and it's characterized by a wide range of reading aloud errors. So like any dyslexia, it's a reading disorder. People with deep dyslexia have more difficulty reading out loud abstract words than concrete words. So there's this kind of semantic distinction in their reading abilities. And they also make what are known as semantic errors. So if you write down, for example, the word weird and ask somebody with deep dyslexia to read it out loud, they might say odd. So it's a different word than what's written, but it shares meaning with the word that's presented. So these are semantic errors, and this is the diagnostic symptom for deep dyslexia. Now, why is this important for this inhibition idea, semantic inhibition idea? Well, there's a theory that basically says the semantic errors produced by somebody with deep dyslexia are a result of failure of inhibition. So, for example, when someone who's neurotypical is shown the word weird, they're going to activate odd, strange, and other associations that are related to the word weird. But they will be able to inhibit those words and then say the correct word. Somebody with deep dyslexia will activate those words, have difficulty inhibiting them, and then those words may slip out of the phonological output lexicon and then be produced. So deep dyslexia is associated with inhibition. Now, if semantically rich metaphors require more inhibition, perhaps we'll see some kind of result here that's consistent with that. So we conducted this case study where we had one participant, his initials are GL. He was 35 at time of test, and he survived a stroke. He had a stroke pretty young in life, but he survived a stroke a few years prior, and he was diagnosed with deep dyslexia. This is a CT scan, so you can see here the left hemisphere. There is he has left hemisphere brain damage. And we asked GL simply to rate the metaphors and the literal sentences and the anomalous sentences I showed you earlier, the same stimulus set. We asked him just rate them for meaning, again, from 1 to 6, no right or wrong answers, and you don't have to read them out loud. This was more of an exploratory study. There have been no studies with deep dyslexia and metaphor, so we didn't have any like firm a priori predictions, but we were primarily interested, will he show sensitivity to these semantic richness variables? So first, I'll show you his results from the literal sentences. Now, we compared his data to the university sample that I described to you earlier that did the initial rating study. So GL is the red bar, the neurotypical controls are the blue bars, and we see that for literal sentences, whether they're high or low semantic density, GL was pretty much at ceiling, so he shows fine comprehension skills for literal meaning. No impairment here. Now, when we look at the metaphors, we see something interesting. Notice that semantically richest condition, the concrete high semantic density metaphors, things like a pen is a sword, GL rated them quite low, on average below 2, so pretty low, okay? Whereas the university sample rated them quite a bit higher. Now, GL was higher relative to this condition for the abstract high semantic density and the concrete low semantic density. He was still lower than the university sample. What's interesting is the semantically sparsest condition, abstract low semantic neighborhood density, GL matched the university sample. So on some conditions, he's way below the sample, and on some conditions, he matches the sample. Okay? And those conditions are characterized by semantic richness. The richer the condition, the lower he is on comprehensibility. However, we haven't looked at the anomalous sentences yet. Okay? So the anomalous sentences, so I just wanted to draw attention to this condition. But if we look at the anomalous sentences, we see that GL rated them quite high, much higher than the university sample. Why did he rate them higher? I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly how they were processed, but he rated them quite a bit higher. Notice again, though, the semantically richest anomalous sentence, and again, these are supposed to make no meaning, right? The ones that were semantically richest were still rated the lowest relative to the other conditions. So to determine if GL processed metaphorical meaning from the metaphors, we have to compare those metaphors to the anomalous sentences and see, were they higher in comprehension than the anomalous sentences? If they're equal to the anomalous sentences, it's going to be hard to say that you processed something kind of figurative about them. So we asked this question, how much higher were GL's metaphor ratings relative to the anomalous sentences in that same condition? And remember here how we showed that the concrete high semantic density, he rated them pretty low, and he also rated the anomalies pretty low. So the concrete high S&D metaphors were only 10% higher in comprehensibility than the anomalous sentences. So we're going to say that those are in the range of anomalies. The abstract high semantic density condition was only 13% higher. So again, that's in the range of anomalies. The concrete low semantic density condition was much higher, but it was still not significantly different. However, the semantically sparsest condition, the abstract low semantic density metaphors, were significantly higher than the abstract low semantic density anomalous sentences. So we can say that GL showed sensitivity to these semantic richness conditions, and that we believe he has a selective metaphor impairment, that his metaphor impairment depends on the semantic richness of the topic and vehicle. And when they're semantically less rich, he can compute those metaphorical abstractions. So this kind of supports that idea that the semantically richer metaphors require more inhibition. Because again, if he has difficulties with inhibition, well, he shows that because he has difficulties with metaphors that require more inhibition. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Yeah.
More than just curiosity.
Yeah.
When you produce the nonsense network, how do you distribute the concreteness, semantic density between these? I mean, there were balance between those high semantic neighborhood, concrete, semantic neighborhood, abstract.
Yeah. They were balanced. I can't remember how did I balance them? So they fit those conditions. Things like word frequency and other variables I ignored, because it gets very difficult to make metaphors. You already have a very limited range, and then you put other things there. So they were balanced on density and concreteness. I believe that's all I balanced them on. Yeah. Thanks.
Did you use novel metaphors or
Yeah, so they were, all the metaphors I made, I tried to start off using anything that was already in a database. So Albert Katz had these norms in the 80s. I used some of those, but then for them to fit the semantic conditions I wanted, sometimes I have to change them a little bit. So they all ended up being novel. They were all novel metaphors. There's debate on what really makes a metaphor novel or not, but they were low familiarity in past norms, and then I made some up, which were of course novel. So I consider them novel metaphors. Okay, so another way to study metaphor processing and metaphor abstraction is to look at what's known as the metaphor interference effect. The metaphor interference effect is demonstrated through sentence verification task. And what this involves is you ask participants to determine if sentences are literally true or literally false. So you're telling them just focus on literal meaning and determine if they're literally true or literally false. The sentences are things like some birds are robins, which is literally true, and then some birds are apples is literally false. What's interesting is there's a small number of sentences that are metaphorical. So metaphorical sentences are literally false, okay? But people have a hard time saying that metaphors are literally false. So if you show them some lawyers are sharks, they do say it's literally false, but they're much slower in saying that relative to an anomalous sentence like some lawyers are pickles. Why is that? Well, because the metaphorical meaning is automatically computed, okay? And it interferes with making that literal judgment. Glucksberg, who discovered this effect, originally believed that that you need a sentence context to have a metaphor interference effect. And he had some arguments why, and he manipulated sentence quantifiers, and he concluded that you need a sentence context. But he never tested if you actually do need that. So I looked at the metaphor interference effect in other variants, and I looked at these compounds. It could be noun-noun kinds of metaphors, like flute bird, or adjective-noun, like creamy sky. And notice that the noun-noun ones, they could technically be literal. There could be a bird on a flute, for example, okay? Or they could be figurative, such that a bird is particularly melodic. So in this task, instead of asking them, I couldn't ask them, is the sentence literally true or literally false? But I could ask the participants, does the compound refer to a concept that literally exists or not? So I had items like recycling bin, literally exists, okay? But these concepts don't literally exist. And we found that there are metaphor interference effects, okay, that these concepts evoke. So metaphorical meaning can be triggered just by compounds without any kind of sentence context. And the metaphor interference effect sizes are similar for both types, and they're similar to the sizes that Glucksberg obtained or observed. And interestingly, when we look at the density of each of these words, the semantic density, and the concreteness, like before, okay, we find that for the adjective nouns, the metaphor interference effect is greater, okay, the less semantically rich the words are. So as an automatic kind of abstraction process, you do see that relationship between semantic richness and metaphorical abstraction. We don't see it with the noun-nouns. I just think the task is a bit too early, maybe for noun-nouns to evoke fine-grained semantic variables. Adjectives are better modifiers than nouns are, so the adjective kind of makes it a bit easier to process that finer-grained semantic representation like density or concreteness. But both types evoke the metaphor interference effect. So we can see through a lot of different tasks, slow tasks, fast tasks, in special populations, and inhibitory kinds of tasks like this, automatic types of tasks like this one, I should say. You see this kind of pattern here with semantic richness of the words somehow being detrimental or a problem for metaphorical abstraction. But what about producing metaphors? All of these tasks were comprehension tasks. What happens when somebody produces a metaphor? And then a question asked earlier is, what about body-object interaction, right? So I wanted to look at production. I want to look at what words do people choose when they're asked to create a metaphor. And I also wanted to look at body-object interaction. As we said, metaphor vehicles tend to be concrete, but we don't really know why. Is it for motoric reasons? Is it more for visual reasons? What concreteness is a multimodal variable, right? So in this study, people were asked to produce comprehensible metaphors, okay, by choosing words to pair with abstract words. So the stimuli was basically abstract words that varied on semantic density. So the words were highly abstract, okay? Here's a sample of some of them. And for each of these words, participants were asked to choose a vehicle from a word bank. So we gave them a bunch of concrete words and said, choose a word to create a metaphor. And the vehicles varied on body-object interaction and semantic density. Okay? They were all concrete. So this is what an experimental, and then just notice again that the abstract words differed only on density. They're all abstract. The topics were all abstract. So this is what an example trial looked like, okay? They would be given the word courage and say, choose a word from this bank, and we would pseudo-randomize the order of these words so they're not just choosing the top right or top left or whatever. And they had to make a metaphor. So they might say, for example, courage is a tiger. And then they would write that down. And I would take note of which words are they choosing. Which words are they choosing as characterized by VOI and semantic density? Overall, participants chose more low body-object interaction words than high body-object interaction words, okay? And this was dependent on other factors in the metaphor. So basically what happens is when the topic is abstract, but it has many semantic neighbors, okay, it's somewhat semantically rich relative to an abstract topic with low number of near neighbors. So when the topic is high semantic density and abstract, what the participants do is they focus on the semantically sparsest, the semantically least rich type of vehicle, which is low body-object interaction and low density, okay? What they're doing is they're decreasing the semantic load of the metaphors they're creating, okay? And so there was this kind of preference for low semantic richness in vehicles. And that tells us perhaps that motoric interaction isn't the primary kind of mechanism for creating metaphorical abstractions, novel metaphorical abstractions. It's a mechanism. It's not that it never happens, but it's not the primary mechanism. Because if it is, you should see high BOI words being chosen more than low. You don't see that. So words like lightning, if we go back to, here, we can see that words like tiger, volcano, and lightning make better metaphors than words like typewriter or fish. Okay, and you can kind of see that when you kind of break apart these words. You can see that, and this is just a sample of some of these. Okay, So some conclusions for the semantic richness studies, okay? One thing I'll conclude is that people have to inhibit properties to compute abstractions. And those properties are verbal kinds of associations, linguistic information captured by semantic neighborhood density. And then also sensory motor representations captured by concreteness and body-object interaction. This inhibition is an automatic kind of process. It's early and it can be compromised as a result of brain damage. And basically, less semantic richness is more effective for creating metaphorical abstraction. Okay. So I want to visit this idea of the abstraction ladder. I'm not sure who coined this. I think the earliest source I found is Hayakawa from 1949, a linguist and a semanticist. And we can think of the abstraction ladder as it relates to these semantic richness variables. So what I'm trying to say here is that we know that there's concrete and abstract ends of this ladder, but how can these semantic richness variables maybe map onto the ladder in some way? And here I'm focused more on the potential for abstraction, and I'm really focused on some fine-grained distinctions, okay? So we can take concrete words that are high body-object interaction and high SND. These are words like telephone, lemon, okay? These words I put at the bottom for potential of abstraction, because we saw in that metaphor production task that they're not really chosen that much for metaphorical meaning. Then we can have words that are also high VOI, but they're a little more semantically flexible because they're from sparse semantic neighborhoods. Okay? So we can have words like balloon and yo-yo. But then we get to words that are low body-object interaction. So again, these are all concrete, okay? But low body-object interaction words can be high semantic density, like dolphin or mountain. You can already see some of these words are maybe a bit better for metaphors. We have words like mountain, right? With a lot of metaphorical abstraction potential. And then you get these low body-object interaction, low density words. And these are words like desert, lightning, okay, tiger. These words, you can argue, you can kind of almost see their metaphorical meaning a little bit more in these words than you can in these semantically rich words like telephone or dog, for example. So the idea is that you can get metaphorical meaning from any of these words, but just some have a bit of a head start in their abstraction because they have less motoric properties, less near neighbors, so they're a bit more flexible. Again, it's a fine-grained distinction. Now, when we get to abstract words on the ladder, I don't have as much to say as I do about the concrete words, but with abstract words, we do see distinctions in semantic density that whatever they do for the concrete words, I think they're also doing for the abstract words. So abstract words that are high semantic density, I think are a bit lower on the ladder than abstract words that are lower semantic density. That came out a bit funny because I said they're lower on the ladder than lower density. But the semantically least rich would be the more abstract. I think there are other variables that would affect abstract words too. I haven't looked at them, but things like emotional valence. There's also a new set of BOI ratings that has some more abstract words. So some abstract words, maybe like obsession, that might have more of a bodily kind of basis to it than destiny. So I think there could be some BOI effect there, but I haven't looked at them at that yet. So I think that these conditions map onto the abstraction ladder in some way, but again, really fine-grained distinctions there. Now, I just want to look at one more thing, okay, which is when people are forming a metaphorical abstraction on the fly in real time, what properties of concepts are they activating? So we saw in that earlier EEG study that you have access to the linguistic system, you have access to abstract meaning, you have access to sensory motor concrete meaning really early when you process concepts. What's going on when you put a concept in a metaphor? What's kind of immediately available? We also know from prior studies that metaphorical meaning is immediately available as well. So when you put a metaphor in context, the meaning of the metaphor is available as soon as you're processing the vehicle. You're done hearing the vehicle, the metaphorical meaning is already there. But we don't know so much about what properties of the vehicle are activated. Are they more sensory motor properties that are activated, or are they more abstract properties? So what elements of the meaning are activated? So to answer this question about semantic properties that are available for computing metaphorical abstraction, I conducted some cross-modal lexical priming experiments. So here, people hear language. They hear something like, my dad told me to drive carefully and stay alert because highways are snakes. And what I was interested in, again, is this word snakes. Snakes has a lot of associations. What kinds of associations are people using to create that abstract metaphorical meaning? So I'm not interested so much in the meaning of the metaphor. I'm interested in what are they using to create the meaning. So I would present visually a word like slither. Slither is a bodily action related to snake, and it's a sensory motor property. And for the bodily action, I'd have a control word that normally is takes the same amount of processing time as slither in a lexical decision task. Then, instead of, or in addition to looking at these bodily actions, I also wanted to look at more abstract associations of snake. So words like danger, okay? So I'd look at danger, and then I'd have a control word for the word danger there. So I looked at two distinct types of words. One would be a sensory motor kind of word. One would be a more abstract word. And I'm interested in, when people hear this, is this activated? Is the bodily action activated? Is the general kind of abstract meaning activated? Are they both activated? Maybe neither are activated. Maybe it's something else people are doing to create this metaphorical meaning. And I just want to reiterate that neither of these words are necessarily the meaning of the metaphor. They're just associates of the vehicle that people will use, potentially use, to create that metaphorical meaning. I also looked at more familiar metaphors like lawyers or sharks. So everyone in the courtroom saw that those lawyers were sharks. People would hear that, and then they would make a lexical decision to bite, which would be a bodily action, a control word, a more general type of word related to shark like killer, and then a control for that. So when I present the metaphor auditorily, and then at the offset of the vehicle, as soon as the vehicle audio ends, I present these words for a lexical decision. I can measure the activation by comparing the reaction time to the target word relative to the unrelated word. So if the target word is responded to faster than the unrelated word, we would say that the target word is activated. So we're just showing the words one at a time, but we're comparing the reaction times. So greater bars mean more activation. Greater bars basically are saying how much faster was the word relative to the unrelated control word. So we see that for the familiar metaphors, the bodily action associates are not actually responded to faster than unrelated words. So they're not activated. It looks like this is something, but it's not significant. However, the general associations are accessible, okay? For the less familiar metaphors like highways or snakes, you see the opposite. Only sensory motor information is accessed, whereas more abstract information about the vehicle is not accessed. Okay? So this is immediately after hearing the metaphor. Well, what happens if you put a second delay? If you Present the metaphor, have a blank for a second, then show the words. Same thing happens. You give more processing time, it doesn't change anything. A second is also a long time to compute metaphorical meaning. Most metaphors are immediate if they're really bad metaphors, but by a second, almost everybody will get the metaphor if there's a meaning there. So what we see here is that unfamiliar and familiar metaphors activate different kinds of information of the vehicle in computing that abstraction. Familiar metaphors more directly activate abstract properties of the vehicle, and then from there that abstraction is computed. Less familiar metaphors, they go a different route. They go from sensory motor information, and then from there develop some kind of abstraction.
Is it because general associations on familiar level are in a way, are kind of conventional and unfamiliar, the body is trying to interpret this kind of associations, find a connection. The two things.
Yeah, so I would say that both familiar and unfamiliar metaphors have to compute an abstraction, but the way that they compute it is different. And it's how you describe it. I agree with that. And how you described it is consistent with this hypothesis, the sensory motor shedding hypothesis, which basically says concrete concepts are processed by embodied simulation or mental imagery and things like that. At least in part, they're processed this way. When you take a concrete concept and then you use it in a metaphor, it's also processed by embodied simulation. So if we take snakes, okay, we can say, the word snakes will evoke some kind of sensory motor processing. Then you could put snakes in a metaphor, say some highways are snakes. That evokes some sensory motor processing. Then you can use that metaphor again, or maybe you can use snakes with other words and say some bridges are snakes, some paths are snakes, some sidewalks are snakes. Okay, so on and so forth. The more you use it, that kind of abstraction becomes more easily computed and maybe even stored in long-term memory. Okay, and so metaphors go from this sensory motor representation that slowly gets shed where an abstraction remains, and that's the sensory motor shedding hypothesis. And the prior studies I just showed you supports this hypothesis. It's why I did this study, was to test this hypothesis. So some conclusions overall are that embodied and disembodied properties of concepts, okay, embodied being from sensory motor experience and then disembodied being from linguistic experience, both of these are sources of semantics. They're accessed very early in individual conceptual processing or in metaphorical abstraction. They're context dependent. Metaphor triggers abstraction. That's the mechanism for processing figurative meanings of metaphor. And again, it triggers this abstraction from concrete concepts. And among concrete words and concrete concepts, there's a lot of variation in their potential for abstraction. And that variation is characterized by richness being detrimental for abstraction. So these are the conclusions I would like to leave you with. And with that, I want to thank Mariana and the Abstraction Group for inviting me here and acknowledge some mentors and colleagues who've helped with this, guiding this research. So thank you, and if I open the floor for questions. Thank you.
This is amazing. This was so rich. So low potential for metaphor, for abstraction.
We're going to keep it literal.
Okay, let's stop the sharing screen. Are there any questions from home, for instance? From Caterina.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much for the talk. And I have just one curiosity. maybe I missed something. Could you repeat again the task about the semantic properties that activate metaphor? Because I didn't get it, which task you used.
Can we show the slides again?
And the second is you focus a lot about body-object interaction.
Yes.
But what about the semantic modalities in metaphor, in construction of metaphor?
Yeah. Great questions. Can you see the slides right now?
Yeah.
You can. Okay. So I'll go over this with everybody one more time. So the task here is a cross-modal priming task. So cross-modal meaning they hear language, and then I'm measuring their reaction time to visually presented words. So how we determine activation is, so for this here, highways or snakes, I looked at associations of snakes from what are called the Nelson norms. So these are verbal responses. So you tell somebody the word snake and then tell them what's the first word that comes to mind. Some people say slither, some people say danger. You get a collection of these strongly activated associations. And so what I would do is I look through those, that list and say, are any of these bodily actions? And sometimes you say, yeah, like slither or bite would be bodily action. And then are any like kind of abstract or not so concrete? And you find, yes, some are descriptives like, danger and things like that. So what I would do is find a bodily action like slither, and I would measure how long it takes somebody to determine that slither is a word. So I'd also have these non-words, okay? So this would be a lexical decision task on the words. So you only show one word. So for example, somebody hears highways or snakes, then I show them the word slither. And then I measure how long does it take them to determine that slither is a word. Another participant might get the word Nash, which is a control word, and I'd see is slither responded to faster than Nash. If it is, we call that lexical or semantic activation, so we'd say it's primed. And then the same thing would happen for the general abstraction-related word. So that's how it is. So the activation is determined relative to an unrelated word. And then when I go to this slide here, that's what the graphs are showing. They're basically showing that for highways are snakes, the word slither was responded to about 60 milliseconds faster than the word Nash. Now, individually, slither and Nash are only 1 millisecond apart. I match the words on regular reaction time. So any differences in this are due to the metaphorical processing. And I also did another study where I just had the vehicle alone, so just snake. Does snake activate both associations? And it does. So when you put the word in the metaphor, that's where you get this differential kind of differential priming effect. Does that clarify? Yeah? And then can you repeat the second question?
I was thinking about the rule of, in general, the sensory modalities in construction of metaphors, because you are, if I understood correctly, you mainly focus on body-object interaction differences that are, I think, more related to the motor part, not the sensory.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question was about different modalities in metaphor. I focused on motoric, and that's true. So the way I think of it is that the visual modality kind of dominates cognition anyway, so it will dominate metaphorical meaning making. We do know that so I looked at that vehicle selection task, okay? I modeled that after Albert Katz's task. He had a task in 1989, it was published, where the vehicles varied on concrete and abstract. And he found that when people are creating metaphors, they choose concrete over abstract. So my study is kind of like, what is it about the concreteness? Well, we know it's not motoric, right? So it's going to be more visual, and then I can't say, I didn't manipulate other modalities, right? And it would be interesting. And for sure, some metaphors are more auditory, some will be more tactile and things like that. But
simply, my will be a nice way to control the stimuli in the 5 modalities, like with the Lancaster norm.
Yeah. I think I agree with you. Future studies should look at these different modalities. And there still will be some metaphors that are going to be high motoric and things like that. But the way I think about modalities is you just want a moderate level of imageability. You don't need multimodal in the same kind of concept. I think there's primarily one modality that carries the meaning, and we kind of see that with BOI. The motoric modality kind of interferes with the visual modality or whatever. Another way to look at modality, I think Cardio has norms on motoric, visual, and auditory. So they have metaphors that differ primarily on those 3. So yeah, I think future studies could kind of characterize that. But my conclusion is the more modalities are going to be a problem in the same concept. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Are there any other comments, questions? From home, from here? Let's see. I really liked the combination of a variety of norms, basically of norming data to explain chronometric data somehow, or to explain, abstraction related cognitive phenomena in general.
Yeah, and a lot of these norms are just kind of used to look at, visual word recognition, or just kind of, one kind of thing. But when you start looking at them in metaphor, it starts to open up a lot of new things about abstraction and about other higher order processes of meaning making, rather than just visual word recognition or memory or whatever.
Indeed. And recently, last week on Friday, we had a lab-to-lab experience with Marco Marelli's lab in Milan, and also this idea about should we trust the ratings emerged, and so. Especially the concreteness ratings. So we are working as well. We are using the concreteness ratings as well in our research on abstraction and so forth. But we are wondering more and more, basically, what is in the concreteness ratings? Yeah. What is that people are actually rating when they rate a concept for concreteness? Is it the tangibility of the referent, the numeric concept? Is it a combination of variables that has to do with body-object interaction, but also to semantic neighborhood density and so forth?
Yeah. So, there's 2 ways to kind of think about it. One is, if you do take this kind of hybrid approach to embodied cognition that I take, right?
Yes.
It's like you have sensory motor representation. You also have linguistic representations.
Yeah.
If you take this kind of approach, then you have to kind of factor in sensory motor properties in addition to linguistic properties. Some people who only take a linguistic-only approach, right, then they would just kind of treat concreteness as a result of some kind of contextual use of words. So, the concreteness effect was, so concrete words are read faster and remembered better than abstract words. That could have been described by dual coding, by saying you're activating imagery and you're activating linguistic representation, whereas abstract words are only activating, so they activate less. The other explanation was that concrete words are just in more contexts, and so it has nothing to do with imagery, it just has to do with language use. So language use could explain concreteness effects. I think that the dual coding theory was, you could see it in different kinds of things. So concrete sentences are still remembered better than abstract sentences. So it's not just about the words, it's also about concrete meaning being more efficient to process. So that explanation would say that it's imageability that distinguishes them. But then again, you still have abstract words that could be high imageability. So imageability doesn't cut across so well either. So words like ghost would be abstract but high imageability. So it can't necessarily be only that. So it still is a bit of a puzzle. But I do think there is some qualitative difference between concrete and abstract. It is continuous. You do have two systems that interact in processing the meaning, but it's hard to see how imageability would play no role in concrete words.
Well, that's great. I think if there are no further questions, we can stop the recording here, and then Hamad will be here with us in Bologna for the next couple of days. So we have plenty of time for working meetings and getting feedback on our project and sub-projects. So thank you again, Hamad, for this brilliant and rich talk. Thank you, everybody, from remote and in presence. And see you again very soon, next time with another abstraction seminar. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.